All right, welcome back to another episode of Form Check Friday with our favorite guest, Mr. Seth.
Not sponsored by an energy drink company yet.
Mr. Dr. Seth, I should say. If you haven't yet, make sure to head over to Seth's Instagram, YouTube, all of that. Go to Dr. Seth Albersworth, find him the places where he is. He's posting daily, and it's exceptional stuff.
Bryce is lying.
I'm going to say it again also. He's very handsome. If you're new to Form Check Friday, we take viewer submissions. People send their videos to us and we critique them. We try to offer advice for powerlifting technique for powerlifters or for anyone interested in doing the power lifts as part of their fitness journey. So if you want to submit, there's a bunch of info in the description box below. And Dylan, our MC.
Hello.
Masters of Ceremony.
Yes.
Do you want to kick us off here, get us started?
Yes.
Who's our first submissionista?
First off, we're starting with Abdul.
All right.
I've been powerlifting for a few years now. I've competed 3 times and placed first in my first 2 meets and second in my last one. Depth and being confident in the bottom is something I've always struggled with. My current competition PR is 140 kilos. As you can see, the second rep was shaky and depth was slightly off. I've been doing pause squats and deep range of motion pause leg presses to remedy this. Any and all tips and advice would be extremely appreciated.
Well, I like to start at the start. And for me, the first thing I notice is out of the rack. You're unracking it pretty aggressively, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the aggression of your unrack does not match the tightness of your upper back, right? So we pop it up out of the rack, and it's wobbling all over the place, and it's kind of throwing you around, which tells me that we're not as locked in on the bar as we could be / maybe need to be. What else do you think, Seth?
You're really upright through the unrack, through the walkout, and then you have to really fight to get any degree of hinge or the degree of hinge necessary to hit depth. And I would bet that if we could have a little bit more hinge through the walkout, a little bit more hinge while you're standing up there, we wouldn't have to have such an aggressive dip in as you're descending, and that could let you find a better torso position, which could let you find an easier time hitting the bottom.
Yeah.
And what I'd want to know is, with the pause squats, are you having depth issues on those pauses as well? Because if you are having depth issues on these, you are having depth issues on the pauses, it might just be a matter of taking a little bit off the bar in the short term so we can reestablish what it feels like to hit depth and then build back up. And it's not fun taking weight off the bar, but if you do it, it allows you to hit a better depth standard. You can just carry it through, build strength, and it will not take as much time as you think to build back up.
Yeah.
It might feel really crappy day one, but it won't take long to get back.
Yeah, it bruises the ego, but I think in the long run, working with weights that you can reliably get to depth every rep, no questions asked, is undeniably the best way to train yourself for depth. I think that doing things like pause squats, full range of motion leg press, I'm maybe a little more iffy on, but I think your head's in the right place with your exercise selection and your accessories there. But I don't think any of those is going to prepare you as well for a competition squat needing to go to depth with pretty heavy weight than always doing your competition squat to depth. And like Seth said, dialing it back a little bit so that we can build some momentum, so that we can get more comfortable and get to the point where we can push some intensity, where we can strain against heavy weights that there's no question about depth on, right?
And I think it is like that comfort thing Bryce was talking about, because it doesn't look like you're necessarily running out of room in the bottom. Mm-hmm. It looks like you're just hesitating because it feels like a position that you're not used to. And when you're working up with weights, I would try to just embrace that discomfort, really try to push into the hole, feel tension down there, feel what it feels like, so when the weights go back up, you're going to be more acclimated to it so you can do a better job with it.
Yeah. Make it harder.
Exactly.
Make it harder for better training effect. One last thing I'm gonna recommend, and we'll see if Seth has one last thing as well, but turn this around if you can. Face out. Especially as a competitor, I'm really against the idea of watching yourself in the mirror. I think a lot of times that's gonna kind of mess you up. It's gonna cause you to rely on a visual feedback where anytime you're performing, you're competing in your sport, you're not going to have that visual feedback. So if you're used to looking at yourself, for example, to try to see depth, you're going to go to a meet, that's gone. All of a sudden you're like, well, what do I do? Where do I get, what's depth? How does that go? But if you don't look in the mirror and you train yourself for what depth feels like, as opposed to what it looks like, then you're gonna be much more able to recreate that on demand whenever. And I can see this other cage over here is set up likely so that you could perfectly put that there and face out if this one isn't, but I think this one probably is as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because looking at the Arsenal rack, it looks like if you put the hooks on the inside, the plates would be hitting the plates.
Yeah, actually there's not a lot of room in there. Yeah.
For a moment I was like, wait, Bryce wants him to walk out backwards?
No. No. I just always assume cages like this have the ability to flip the J-cups. But
I used to be the guy that walked out backwards.
Really?
Way back in the day.
Walked in backwards. Or walked out forwards.
Yeah, walked out forwards, yeah.
Yeah.
That was sketchy. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. If you're doing that, if you're watching and you're doing that, don't do that. You don't want to be guessing walking backwards after your set.
Yes.
And trying to like put it back in the rack.
And not only was I the guy that walked out of the squat the wrong way, my friend and I that were training together, we used to think it was weird to back spot, so we'd try to front spot each other on a squat. So we're basically like kissing as I was squatting. It was
less weird to front spot.
Yeah, I'm glad those videos don't exist.
I wish they did, honestly.
Yeah.
We would feature them right now. Did you have anything else you wanted to add for this lifter?
I think you covered it, because the big thing I was thinking, like right off the bat, other than depth, was the upper back tightness and that unracked pop, but we got that. And I think like if we can get the back tighter, if we can have a little bit more hinge through the walkout, through the initiation, it should make depth easier, and then just get comfy being down there.
Yeah, I think that's also going to help with the back tightness too, right? Because if this lifter is trying to like
fighting to keep
fight
the bar
against
on,
the bar rolling off their back, I mean, he's not going to have a good time. Whereas with a little bit more tilt, that bar's going to be just driving into his shoulders instead of feeling like it's going to fall off.
Yep.
All right, Dylan, who is our next victim?
Next up, we have Hunter.
Hunter.
Retesting max after a hypertrophy focused meso.
Did he win it?
135 kilo warm up went up easy. I would love some insight as to whether missing this lift was a technical problem or if it's just a pure strength issue. So I think this is more, or is this 135 too?
140.
140? I obviously need to do some left tricep work. It's pretty sore after this lift, but it's unusual to hit such a strong sticking point.
So if you just finished a hypertrophy block, what I want to know is that if this was just a test immediately after the hypertrophy block, or if you had any sort of transition phase to get back to doing singles, because if you just aren't used to doing heavy singles, the hypertrophy block isn't going to really set you up to do well on a heavy single, and you might just need more time to get used to displaying strength again, because on a hypertrophy phase, you're not really displaying strength, and displaying strength is a skill, and that just might be what is missing here a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great sort of angle to come at this from, is, you know, a programming standpoint. If you don't have that period to bridge the gap, right? It's like we have this phase of training where the goal is to add mass, to add muscle to your body, but, you know, even if we assume, you know, at its face that, you know, more muscle means more strength. I don't think it's quite that simple, but let's just assume that's the transition. We're still not going to be able to utilize that in a coordinated way until we've had enough training exposure to, like Seth said, the skill. And that's a really big thing that I think a lot of people miss, is that strength is a skill. And the displaying of that strength is a skill. Doing a heavy single with 100% of your 1 rep max is a skill. That's why you'll see novice lifters who can take 100% and miss it one time and try again 10 minutes later and get it. And even some experienced lifters, right? Like it is a skill, and it scales and challenges the heavier it gets. But yeah, I think definitely having some exposure to that is going to be a big thing. Now, I would caution you against anything that's like left tricep work. I think, you know, your left tricep being sore just means probably we got a little off kilter, it worked a little harder that day. Doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that your left tricep is that much weaker. In fact, I think a really common misconception with this kind of a sticking point is that it is the triceps, and my counterpoint would be that it's probably your upper back. and the sort of more postural or positional muscles in your shoulder girdle, and the sort of strength endurance of those muscles being able to keep your shoulder blades and sort of upper body in general in place.
Because like where the bar stops isn't always where the miss starts. And if we look at how you're touching, how you're transitioning out of the bottom, you're sloppy way before the bar slows down. And if we get rid of some of that slop, the bar probably wouldn't need to slow down as much.
Yeah. So I think, future training considerations here before we even get into the technique of it would be way more pause work. Getting comfortable with that touch. Much like the previous lifter, we were talking about getting comfortable in the bottom position, just, training yourself to be used to being there, finding the discomfort, being like, okay, we're gonna spend some time here and making the discomfort more comfortable. I think that's one of the biggest associations for me, one of the biggest sort of like proxies rather that I can take from my training is if I'm feeling comfortable on the chest, like I could spend, an extra couple seconds there, then I'm in a good place with my bench overall, because that is, the most challenging position to maintain. It's the most crucial maybe position, at least, to maintain shoulder position, to make sure that you can, drive up from a good position. And if we're inconsistent with how we're touching, with the weight of the touch, with what our legs are doing during the touch, with what our shoulders are doing, our elbows are doing, all of those things come into play when we're talking about how we come off the chest. And coming off of the chest and to the chest in this case looks like it's maybe a little bit of an afterthought. And again, that's where the skill development of, practicing some heavy singles and stuff like that comes into play.
Absolutely. I don't got much to add to that.
Yeah. If we were to analyze this from like a technical standpoint, I would say probably a little bit more control to the chest. We get to a point about midway down where the bar just kind of drops. The touch point, I would love to see more reps to see if that touch point is consistent. If this is, higher or lower than you normally touch, that can have a big impact on how that bar's coming back off your chest. Leg drive looks a little bit inconsistent. Generally speaking, I'll coach most lifters, especially early on, to just practice a nice, smooth, consistent leg drive where the entire purpose of your legs pushing is to reinforce the position of your upper body, this, sort of chest up, shoulders down, as opposed to really trying to contribute a lot to that overcoming inertia off the chest. So I think a combination of those things, cultivating a little bit more upper back tightness as you press, because we can absolutely see as you come off the chest, shoulder blades come out of position, which means elbows get way out of position, which means we just kind of run out of pressing power at some point.
And like everything that Bryce is talking about there from the technical standpoint, all kind of comes back to just deliberate practice specific to how you want to be benching. And if you just are deliberate with practice, deliberate with skill building, deliberate with training, deliberate with handling weights in this range after hypertrophy phase, it's going to come around.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next up we have Fabian or Fabian?
I would guess Fabian.
Fab Ian.
Fab. He's an Ian who is fabulous.
One of the two. Nevertheless, I've noticed recently that when I pass my knees on the deadlift, I tend to rebend the knees and then finish the lift. Any ideas if this is a problem and if I can fix it with either strengthening a weak muscle or just work on lighter weights with technique focus?
I really liked his setup until I didn't. And I'm curious if you don't like the same thing I don't like.
I'm gonna guess it's that.
We'll wait for it. That part.
The big shoulder shrug.
Yep. Because it's
Okay.
like you're nice and tight, your tensions, and then it's like you just give up all the tension you created to go there.
I see what you're saying. I think he does a decent enough job of finding it again. I think for me it's the knees.
Yeah?
It looks to me like if we were to see this lifter from head on, we'd see like a pretty
bow in.
internally rotated hip, causing putting those knees a little closer together than they need to be, just being a little crowded. And I think that's maybe like the first of a few things that causes that sort of ramping.
Yep.
But I definitely, like Fabian does really spend a lot of time starting about here. We can see like we're getting pretty locked in there, right?
And even there, like if you look at that spot, his he's got a little bit less knee flexion.
He does.
And he's a little bit less bowed in there versus where he ends up after the big.
Yeah, and I think part of that's going to be hip height as well, right? If we look at where he's got his hips set here, his hips are a little higher, and that might actually just be a better start position than when he does this and then sits super far down.
Yep. And like, he's doing okay for kind of squatting the deadlift right off the get-go, but the problem is that the knees are so flexed at the beginning that they're not extended enough by the time he gets to the knees, and then that kind of causes the ramp to happen.
Yeah.
And I would bet that if he just started from the position that we were outlining that was better, instead of having that big knee swing in, he probably wouldn't have as much of a ramping issue if he is able to maintain quad tension while doing that.
Yeah. And I think that was where I would probably go next. Like, number one, I think this higher hip position, knees out into your arms a little bit, maybe even widen the grip just to make a little bit of space for your knees in there. But start position aside, I think, like Seth was saying, you mentioned, staying in the quads throughout. And I think that's what happens to a lot of lifters is we get to here and, maybe we feel like we're starting to run out of gas in the posterior chain there. We're not comfortable continuing to kind of pull from there. But what ends up happening is we go really far forward on the toes, we scoot the knees underneath so that we can get the torso more upright. Whereas what I would generally recommend a lifter do is from this point, keep those knees and the quads going while we're pulling the back and the hips through. Because when we shove the knees forward like that, you can see we very much, it's not even necessarily that we rebend the knees, it's we just pivot our weight forward so that we don't end up straightening the knees yet. And then we can use this leverage advantage to kind of get the hips and back through, and then you kind of lock the knees last. Now, the last thing that I'm gonna mention here before I pass it back over to Seth is this lockout of really like pop through and down. Like, if you're gonna do that much work to get to the lockout, especially again, if you're looking to compete, spend some time there. Lock it out, hold it, and down, right? It doesn't have to be long, it doesn't have to be a freedom hold or any kind of like grip, strength thing, unless it has to be. But make sure you're selling your lockouts, make sure that you're holding your balance, and that's gonna go a long ways as a competitor.
And I've historically struggled with the bit of soft D too late in the rep, a little bit of ramp. And what I do to combat that is I am thinking about trying to lock my knees as soon as I can. And that cue works well for me because I tend to bias towards looking like this. I'm not someone who's gonna lock their knees too early. So if I really just try to focus on getting them as soon as I can, it ends up being in the right spot. If you're someone who does have a tendency to lock their knees early, you probably don't wanna think that. But in this case, we might just wanna think like as soon as the bar breaks the floor, just flex those quads as hard as possible. Try to get those knees locked a little bit sooner because a little bit sooner will make lockout cleaner. Yeah,
and it'll keep you a little more balanced on your feet, right? Like we're doing, like I said, that little bit of pivoting kind of as the bar comes across the knees. And, it doesn't result in any kind of balance issue here, but anytime we're like shifting mid-lift, probably not as ideal. So yeah, I think just bear all that in mind and hopefully that helps. Like, you're clearly strong enough to get this weight through to lockout, right? Like, it moves decently well. Even, like, I think a lot of times when that ramp starts to come in is when people get much higher in intensity, right? And they're about to run into a really nasty sticking point. But I think here we're almost like trying to go around a sticking point that maybe doesn't exist yet. So yeah, I think you're definitely strong enough to just be a little bit more patient. And maybe that's part of it from like the psychological level is trying to be patient through that midpoint and have the patience to just like stick with it, just keep pushing, don't change a bunch of stuff, try to speed it up at the lockout. All right, Dylan, number 4.
Number 4, we have Vincent. Or Vincent, whichever you prefer. I'm not here to tell you how to read names. This is
Dylan's pronunciation of everyone's names is the new standard meme.
This is 335 for reps, and he says, I widen my stance, which is allowing for better depth, but I feel physically I can't do deeper or I lose position. I stretch and do mobility daily, but I'm considering heeled shoes as a last hope. I'm forcing myself to go lower, but I'm more lean forward. It is super taxing on my hips and low back in general and causing recovery issues. The video was before I tried going lower. Any tips on form or depth would be appreciated.
Okay, so if this video is before he tried going lower, I would like to see what it looks like when he goes lower. Because again, like my biggest thing here is with the depth is it doesn't look like he's running out of space here. So again, like I'm curious to see what it looks like when he does push into it harder.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of does look like he's running out of depth to me, or running out of room. I feel like he's really trying to maintain this extension here, and I think that's one of those sort of classic cases of just getting bound up. I guess from trying to be too upright. Sorry,
it doesn't look like he's running out of flexibility.
Right. Yeah, I think more than anything, to me it looks like a bracing and a confidence thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think getting a little bit more of that ability to let yourself go into some hip flexion on the way down is going to be a game changer, right? Getting a little bit more of that ribs down brace. A heeled shoe's not a bad idea. Might be the angle of your femurs, right? If we're going 2 knees out and your hip structure is not built to be, wide and knees out, maybe wide and a little more straightforward, right? Like you can have both, and it's less common, I think, to have somebody who's pretty wide stance with really straightforward, or somebody who's really narrow and really toed out. But I've worked with lifters on both ends of that spectrum, and have had a lifter who ran into hip issue after back issue, and all of a sudden, the one day he came in and his feet were this close together and toed out like crazy, and I was like, what are we trying here? And I don't think he ever had another problem with his hips and back squatting. And it's just a weird sort of.
With what Bryce was talking about in terms of brace and ribcage position, it looks like you're really trying to present with a super up chest. And the thing that happens is if we're really arched, we have a super up chest, it's going to require more hip flexion in order to get to the bottom. So if we're more comfortable with creating a ribs down brace, locking in, being okay with that ribcage falling a little bit, it'll actually take less room at the hips to get lower.
So I think, what Seth was saying was it doesn't look like we're running out of mobility, like we're running out of the ability for your knees or hips to go lower. But what I was seeing and what Seth said there is basically just that your brace, I think, is artificially restricting you. Yeah. So I think that with that is going to come some work with how we're bracing in the upper back, because you can see on a lot of these reps, as we hit the bottom, those shoulders are kind of rolling up, shrugging forward. And whether or not that's a product of the brace, I think it might be, because if we look at how you're setting before each rep and on the way down, it looks like you're really trying to drive elbows forward, which again, I think is one of those things that creates this kind of artificial tightness as opposed to actual tightness, right? Passive versus active, I would say. We wedge those elbows forward and the shoulder blades will get pulled down by that action, but we're not actually pulling the shoulder blades down using the muscles that pull the shoulder blades down. We're doing it by changing some other joint structure that just wedges them into a position that it's really hard to hold if we're not active with it.
And an upper back strategy that I would like to see that could be a little bit different is when you're getting set under the bar, the first thing I would do is try to pinch your elbows behind you, and then instead of thinking elbows forward, just think elbows into rib cage. And if we're thinking elbows into rib cage, they are going to come forward, but we're not going to get this over scoop way in, craning the chest up as we're going.
Yeah. So I think that's most of what I think we're seeing here is coming from your torso and sort of, the edges of it in terms of how your pelvis is oriented because of that really sort of chest up, and how the shoulder blades are sitting because we're driving the elbows forward like that. And I think, if we can just work on that, I think you're going to find depth. I think you're going to find it more comfortably. And, if the other thing is, if we're getting to the point where we're struggling with these last few reps as much as we are, as high as they are, I would say we probably want to pull back on the overall loading a little bit, right? Because if we can take a rep that's maybe an inch or two high here, and we're still hitting a solid 8 RPE, if we take that 2 inches lower, we're probably looking at a 10. So you will have to adjust expectations and, you know, E1RM and loading and all that kind of stuff as you adjust your depth, but that's just part of the game. When I was first kind of getting into, I guess, powerlifting, or starting to think about powerlifting, think about numbers, and was being driven by that in lifting, at the time I had a day where I did squats and a day where I did deep squats. And my squats day, I think I was hitting 465 for sets of 6 or 5 or whatever. I thought I was such a badass. And then on my deep squats day, I would squat like 305, 315 for about the same reps. And it got to a point where I was like, okay, I want to test my maxes. You know, I just got a copy of Jim Wendler's 531 for powerlifters, and I want to make sure I'm going in there with appropriate numbers. So I'm going to test my maxes. And on this day, I'm gonna go rock bottom. I'm gonna go to the basement. And I went in there thinking like, oh, I'll squat 535, 545. I think I squatted 405, and it was an absolute like 11 RPE, eyes bulging out of my head, max effort, limit lift. So I think that the maturity of like evolving the depth and evolving expectations with it is kind of part of a rite of passage, unless you're, you know, lucky enough to have your first day of squatting be in like a powerlifting gym and you just have the standard set from the start. But yeah.
I had a very similar thing happen to me when I signed up for my first meet, because my entire reference of getting started in powerlifting came from watching old Westside videos. So I thought that's what the depth was. I thought that was the perfect standard, and I was squatting to the standard that I was seeing watching those videos. Little did I know that signing up for CPU meet, the standard that they expected would be very different. And I was so fortunate to have someone tell me that at 8 weeks out from the meet. But it was a giant shock to realize how much freaking harder it got to get that 4 inches lower, and it hurt at first. Not physically, it hurt emotionally, egotistically, because I had to knock like 90 pounds off of my working weights in order to get down there. But by the time I got to the meet, it came back to the point where I was able to hit an all-time PR squatting 4 inches lower than I ever had before. So again, it doesn't take much time to adapt to it if you give yourself the chance to adapt to squatting deeper in the strength it needs. Because again, like, you're not weak, you're just squatting a little bit high. So if we take the time to get more comfortable, build it up, it'll come back quick.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Last up,
our last submission for today's Form Check Friday.
We have Mario, but with a D, so Dario. Or it could be Dario. It depends on how you say it, because some people say Mario as well. So that's who we got. I've had slightly inconsistent lockout on deadlift. I used to shelve and hitch a lot, but since I started competing, I've been trying not to do that. This is an RP8 double on deadlifts using your program, and felt pretty good other than the weird lockout on rep 2. This is relatively common, but doesn't happen all the time, with some of my heaviest and hardest reps even being way cleaner. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. In my first meet, I got 1 red light because I locked my knees too early, but then had a perfectly fine next attempt. What could be causing this, and what cues or variations would help?
I was gonna try to say your name in like a Mario and Luigi voice, thinking it would be funny, but I'm very glad I decided not to do that.
It's a me, Dario?
Little more, you know, emphasis on the Italian.
Yeah,
but
all right.
I don't know what to really think of that. I'm gonna have to watch a few more reps to really wrap my head around where he's getting stuck or why. And then my first thought was like, is he just getting stuck on a sweatpants? But no, it doesn't look like that.
No. I think if we watch this first rep, we kind of pull off the floor maybe a little differently, right? We maybe end up with slightly higher hips, and I think that allows us to keep a more neutral back angle. And I think in rep 2, as we come up off the floor, he's really keeping the hips wedged forward, which rounds out the back a bit. And then we start getting hung up because we're kind of missing some extension there. I think we rushed the knee lock on rep 2.
He's out of butt, he's out of leg, he's just relying on spine.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things I would say is maybe, you know, try loosening the belt, try to feel out your bracing and feel out your hip position a little more without that belt like interfering. And the other thing I would say is probably try to keep your hips a little bit higher and kind of back up behind you so that you're able to maintain a better back position. It might feel a little more stiff-legged, but you know, that's essentially the stiff-legged component of it. The hinge at the end is kind of where we're getting a little caught up. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a bad thing either.
And seeing the discrepancy between rep 1 and rep 2, it might just be worth doing like a harder reset between your reps, just so we can try to get into a more realistic position again instead of just like rushing and going.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a better problem than your first rep being bad,
Yes.
right? It has obviously, like you mentioned, impacted you at competition. So I think if you were to do sets as, you know, cluster singles, you know, maybe that improves your your hit rate, your consistency overall. Because first rep looked great, and I think part of the reason is because you try to wedge your hips really low, and I know I coach a lot of the times for lifters to really try to, you know, keep their hips where they set them, keep the knees forward. But what happens here is we see this like little bit of the hips kicking up behind you, and I think that actually ends up putting you into a slightly better position. And I think what happens here is you get less of the hips kicking up behind you. We're focusing more on keeping things forward, and that's where we start to get rounded out. Whereas I think if you just let those hips up behind you, you'd be able to maintain a little more extension and maybe clean that up a little.
100%. And seeing too, like just on the note of like the harder reset, I don't even think he necessarily needs to go to a cluster single, but it's like he's setting the bar down, the bar is still bouncing as he's wedging into the next one, and that could be part of what's going on there.
Right. So taking a second between reps, even if you don't let go of the bar,
Just let it settle.
Let it settle, you know, bring your hips back up and get that little bit of like a proprioceptive or kinesthetic like reset, right? So stretch the hamstrings up and then refine that position.
An alternate strategy with the bumpers and on an Olympic lifting platform that is going to have bounce is you could even just try controlling the eccentric more just to kind of load into it, and then you wouldn't have to reset as hard to eliminate that bounce and eliminate the positional weirdness.
Yeah. And I think sometimes doing a bit more of an eccentric can actually be a really valuable learning tool for people's start positions, right? Because I don't normally, you know, I'm definitely not one of those people who's like, well, if you can't set it down right, don't lift it right. I've heard that in so many stupid commercial gyms. And then I think the one time my lifter felt really bad and awkward about it and then tried to set it down light and hurt their back. And anyways, I'm not saying that like you should always set it down right, but if you do some purposeful eccentric stuff, maybe a little lighter, it can be a useful thing even just in warm-ups to be like, okay, if I set this bar down and I were to do like the most cheaty rep ever and just like barely touch the floor, what position would I be pulling from then? And you can find often some really good leverage, some really good tension, and then ideally take that and kind of try to model your start position off of how you would have set it down.
You're not multiply enough if you think that's the most cheaty way to do a deadlift rep.
I just mean like if you were to do like full-blown touch and go deadlifts, right? And you were to like barely touch the floor and come back up.
What about the bounce and go?
I mean that, yeah, there's
Get the rebound.
okay, the second most cheaty way.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah.
I was so proud of Brianna last night.
Yeah?
She was doing a hard deadlift rep set.
Yeah.
And she usually has a tendency, like if she's getting into like the harder into reps, she'll start touch and going.
Like being a little more
Like she'll
cautious on the eccentric and
like do the legit touch and go just tap.
okay, yeah.
She didn't do it last night, and I was like, big yes, good work.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. I feel like we've kind of like come to a very similar conclusion in each one of these 3 Form Check Fridays, and that is that often making your training harder is going to have a better training effect.
And the downside of that is like if we're making training harder, we might not be lifting as much in the gym, but the upside is we're going to lift more on the platform, and that really is the goal.
Honestly, I can't pick a better note to go out on, so we're going to let that note ring. Make sure to head over to Dr. Seth Albersworth on YouTube for more beautiful nuggets of wisdom from a beautiful man, and subscribe to him
first.
Anyways, we hope you all enjoyed it. Who should we get next? Who else do you want to see on Form Check Friday? We're going to bring Seth back for sure, but we might just try to get more guests more often on here because, I don't know, I had a lot of fun. Dylan probably did. I think he's just glad he had to talk less.
I think I talked about the same, but
I was disappointed in the lack of Dylan. Like having watched these leading up into this, I was like, wanted Dylan to be more in it, so I apologize.
All right, so Dylan, send it off.
Bye.